There is a diary sitting inside the Hampshire record office. It is a small thing. Leather-bound, unremarkable, the sort a Victorian solicitor's clerk might carry in his coat pocket. Most of its entries concern the weather. A few mention the cost of ale. One, dated Saturday, the 24th of August, 1867, contains a sentence that has not stopped disturbing the English-speaking world for more than 150 years. Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. 7 words. No explanation, no remorse, no attempt to obscure what he had done. Frederick Baker, a 29-year-old clerk in the employ of a respectable solicitor in Alton, Hampshire, sat down at his desk after work that Saturday evening and wrote those words into his diary as though recording the temperature. And the girl he was writing about was 8 years old. Her name was Fanny Adams. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something about the town where this happened, and about the kind of world it occupied in the summer of 1867. Alton was a market town of no particular distinction. It sat in a green fold of Hampshire countryside, approximately 55 miles southwest of London, and it had grown up around a ford on the northern branch of the River Wey. The ancient market town predated the Norman conquest, and by the 19th century it had settled into the rhythm of a prosperous agricultural community. Its high street still contained coaching inns from the old London to Winchester road. The Swan, which still stands today, was once a noted staging post where horses were changed and travellers rested before the final leg into Winchester. By mid-century, the town had become a centre for hop growing. 2 breweries operated there, drawn by the abundance of hops and the superior quality of the Wey's water. The hop gardens, with their tall poles and trailing vines, surrounded the town on 3 sides. The air in summer carried the bitter, earthy scent of the harvest, and the rhythm of life followed the agricultural calendar. The hops were picked by hand, the same families returning year after year to the same fields. The ale was brewed. The market held its weekly trade. The church bells marked Sundays. The town's geography matters because it explains what happened next. To the north of the High Street lay Tanhouse Lane, a relatively short road that led out toward Flood Meadow and the surrounding River Wey. The meadow took its name from the seasonal flooding of the Wey, which sometimes turned the low ground into marshland in winter. In summer it was dry, green, and bordered on its far side by the hop gardens of Amory Farm. A sunken section of an old road, known locally as the Hollow, ran alongside the hop garden. It was a quiet place, screened by hedgerows and tall hop poles, invisible from the main lanes unless you knew where to look. Alton had experienced no serious crime within living memory. Not one resident could recall a local murder in their lifetime. The constabulary dealt with petty theft, the occasional public drunkenness, disputes over grazing rights. Violence, real violence, was something that happened in the industrial cities, in the rookeries of London and the slums of Manchester. Children played freely in the lanes and meadows that surrounded the town. Parents saw no reason to restrict them. Mothers sent their children out in the morning and expected them home by supper. The world beyond the hedgerows was London's problem. Alton was safe. That single word, safe. Safe, governed every decision Harriet Adams made on the afternoon of the 24th of August. If you are watching this, because something in the title caught your attention, if you chose to spend this time with a story you did not know, then you are already the kind of person this channel was made for. Consider staying. There is a small icon below this video. It costs nothing to press, and it tells us you are here. That is all we need to keep bringing you stories like this one. Fanny Adams was born on the 30th of April, 1859, in Tanhouse Lane, on the northern side of Alton. She was the 4th child of George Adams, a bricklayer employed by the local building firm J.H. and E. Dyer, and his wife Harriet, formerly Mills. By the summer of 1867, the family had grown to include two younger sisters. Elizabeth Ann, known as Lizzie, was 5. Lily Ada was barely a year old. The family was locally rooted. George Adams and his wife Anne, believed to be Fanny's grandparents, lived next door. The Adamses were not wealthy, but they were established. George earned a steady wage. Harriet supplemented his income by taking in the neighbor's laundry. The children were adequately fed, properly clothed, and by all available accounts loved. The 1861 census confirms Fanny living with her parents and 5 siblings. Contemporary newspaper descriptions, published after her death, paint a picture that is unusual in Victorian crime reporting for its tenderness. Lloyd's weekly newspaper described her as a tall, comely and intelligent girl who bore the appearance of being several years in advance of her age. She was known locally for her lively and cheerful disposition. Her best friend, Minnie Warner, was the same age and lived 2 doors down on Tanhouse Lane. The 2 girls were inseparable. Let me hold here for a moment, because what I have just described is a life that was ordinary. Fanny Adams was not remarkable in the way that history usually requires its subjects to be. She was not a public figure. She was not wealthy. She left behind no letters, no journal, no record of her thoughts. She was 8 years old, and she was happy, and she lived in a safe place with people who cared about her, and that should have been enough. The fact that it was not enough is what makes this story one of the most disturbing in Victorian criminal history. Saturday, the 24th of August, 1867, was reported by every newspaper that later covered the case as fine, sunny and hot. George Adams left the house just before noon to play cricket for the church bell ringers team in their annual match against the village band team. The match was held on the Butts, a pleasant area of grassland to the west of the town. Harriet stayed home with baby Lily and busied herself with household chores. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Fanny, her 7-year-old sister Lizzie, and Minnie Warner announced that they were going to play in the meadows. Harriet agreed. The meadows were 400 yards from their front door. Every child in the neighborhood played there. Fanny was wearing a white pinafore, red wool underskirts, and a brown velvet hat. The 3 girls walked up Tanhouse Lane, passed through the gate at its end, and entered Flood Meadow. On the far side of the meadow, a sunken section of an old road, known locally as the Hollow, ran alongside the hop garden of Amory Farm. The girls knew this landscape as well as they knew their own bedrooms. They had played here dozens of times. The River Wey sometimes flooded the area in heavy rain, but in August it was dry, warm, and entirely peaceful. As the girls walked into the hop garden, they met a man. Frederick Baker was 29 years old. He had been born into a family whose history would later form the core of his defense. His father, George Baker, was a man with violent tendencies who had, by his own later testimony, shown an inclination to assault and even to kill his own children. A cousin had been committed to an asylum on 4 separate occasions. A sister had died of what Victorian medicine called brain fever, a catch-all term that could mean encephalitis, meningitis, or scarlet fever. Baker himself had attempted suicide after an unsuccessful love affair, a detail that the defense would seize upon as evidence of inherited instability. He had moved from Guildford to Alton approximately 12 months earlier to take a position as solicitor's clerk to a Mr. Clements, whose office sat on Alton High Street, directly opposite the Swan Hotel. Baker was known in town, though not well liked. He was a decidedly odd character, often seen skulking around the streets of Alton, exhibiting a range of morbid and eccentric behaviors that attracted comment but not, crucially, intervention. He was described as slightly built, with a corpse-white complexion, dark sparkling eyes, and a characteristic tall hat. He dressed in a black frock coat, light waistcoat, and light-colored trousers. He was seen frequently at the Swan, where he drank, sometimes heavily. His fellow clerk, Maurice Biddle, would later testify that Baker had been drinking on the afternoon in question. Witnesses who encountered him that Saturday confirmed it. He also claimed, unconvincingly, to be a music hall entertainer. The portrait that emerges from the trial testimony and newspaper accounts is of a man who existed in the gap between respectability and something far darker. His clothing was that of a professional man. His employment was steady and unremarkable. His daily routine was the routine of 1,000 other solicitors' clerks across Hampshire. But beneath that surface, in the spaces that no colleague or neighbor bothered to examine too closely, something was profoundly wrong. And nobody looked. Baker approached the 3 children. He gave Minnie and Lizzie 3 half-pennies to spend on sweets and Fanny another half-penny. The girls had seen Baker before at church meetings and felt no alarm at taking money from a man they recognized. "She's 66 years old." Baker then picked blackberries for the children and watched them run up and down the hollow, racing one another and eating the berries he had gathered. At a few minutes before 2 o'clock, a woman named Eliza White was walking along the footpath above the hollow. She looked down and saw a man with 3 children. The children were picking berries and flowers. The man was loitering with his hands in his pockets, smoking something dark. Mrs. White watched them for approximately 15 minutes. Then the children turned and ran into the hollow, and the man followed them, and Mrs. White saw nothing more. An hour later, Lizzie and Minnie decided they had had enough of playing and went home. Baker approached Fanny and asked her to accompany him to the nearby village of Sheldon. Fanny refused. It was then that Baker picked her up and carried her into the hop garden. Lizzie and Minnie ran back to Tanhouse Lane, to the home of Minnie's mother, Martha Warner. They told her that a man had taken Fanny. Martha Warner ignored them. This detail is worth sitting with. 2 children aged 7 and 8 ran to the nearest adult and reported that a man had taken their friend. The adult dismissed what they said. And the 2 girls, because they were children, and because they trusted the judgment of an adult more than their own, went back to playing, sometime between 2 and 3:30 that afternoon. Frederick Baker murdered Fanny Adams. What happened in that hop garden has no business being described in detail. The post-mortem findings, the newspaper reports, and the trial transcripts all document what was done, and all of them struggle with the language. Fanny was decapitated, her body was dismembered, her limbs, torso, and internal organs were scattered across a wide area of the hop field. Some parts of her body were never found. A large stone, later recovered from the field with blood, long hair, and a small piece of flesh adhering to it, was identified by the divisional police surgeon, Dr. Louis Leslie, as the probable murder weapon. His post-mortem finding was that death had been caused by a crushing blow to the head. 2 small knives were found on Baker when he was arrested. Both were stained with blood. The prosecution would later argue that these were used for the dismemberment. The defense contended, perhaps correctly, that they were insufficient to have carried out the crime and that another weapon must have been used. That weapon was never found. I want you to hold one detail in your mind now. The stone that killed Fanny Adams weighed enough to crush the skull of an 8-year-old child. It was found lying in the hop garden, spattered with evidence of what it had done. And Frederick Baker, after using it, walked back to his office on the high street, sat down at his desk and opened his diary. Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. Now, if you have been listening this far, you have not looked away. That tells me something about you. Before we continue, I need to ask because it matters. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story has already begun to settle under your skin the way the best true history does, the kind you cannot shake, press that button. Just once. It helps this channel survive, And it tells us that stories like this one still matter to someone. The discovery of Fanny's body was made by Thomas Gates, a laborer, at approximately 5 o'clock that afternoon. He had been walking near the hop garden when he found the child's head and one of her eyes lying on a pole of hops. What he saw sent him running to the nearest house. Within minutes, the alarm had spread across Alton. Harriet Adams learned that something had happened to her daughter when neighbors came to the house. She collapsed on her way to inform George, who was still at the cricket match on the butts. Word was sent instead. When George Adams was told what had been found, he went home, took his loaded shotgun, and set out to find the man who had done it. His neighbors intercepted him. They took the gun from his hands and sat with him through the night. The next morning, hundreds of people from Alton and the surrounding villages descended on the hop garden. They came to help search for the rest of Fanny's remains. Most of her body parts were collected that day, but an arm, a foot, and her intestines were not found until the following morning. Her clothing, cut and scattered across the field, was recovered in pieces. Her hat was never found. Superintendent William of Hampshire Constabulary arrested the obvious suspect at his workplace that evening. Baker was at Mr. Clement's office on the High Street. "I know nothing about it," he said, in the first of many protestations of innocence. Chiney escorted him through an angry crowd to Alton police station. The wristbands of Baker's shirt and his trousers were spotted with blood. His boots, socks, and trouser bottoms were wet. When confronted with the blood, Baker said, "That won't hang me, will it?" He explained, nonchalantly, that it was his habit to step into the water when out walking. He could not explain how his clothing came to be blood-stained. 2 small knives were found on him during the search, one of them stained with blood. Then Superintendent Chiney did what every good investigator does. He went back to Baker's desk and searched it. Among the legal papers, he found the diary, Saturday, the 24th of August, 1867. Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. Baker's conduct during interrogation was described by every observer as cool, collected, and entirely devoid of emotion. He did not exhibit at any point symptoms of insanity or remorse. He maintained that his conscience was clear and professed to wonder who the guilty party might be, expressing the hope that he would be found. In Alton's police cells, he was reportedly disturbed in his sleep and physically shuddered at the sight of meat. When transferred to Winchester Prison, he ate and slept well. He told the prison chaplain that he was innocent. The inquest into the death of Fanny Adams was held at the Duke's Head Inn on Butts Road, Alton, on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 27th of August, 1867. Deputy County Coroner Robert Harfield presided. Baker was brought in handcuffs from the police station. The crowd assembled outside the inn howled and jeered as he was led inside. The Hampshire Telegraph reported on Baker's appearance. Somewhat slightly built, and if his features are not prepossessing, they are by no means repulsive. He was naturally pale, and his eyes being singularly sparkling, the anxiety which he manifests has rendered his appearance very careworn. The first witness was Minnie Warner. She told the jury that Baker had given her money, that he had watched the children play, and that he had asked Fanny to go with him. She was unable to positively identify Baker in the dock, but correctly described what he was wearing. Fanny's father, George, was called next. He identified the remains as those of his daughter. The Morning Herald reported that the poor man seemed nearly heartbroken and gave his brief evidence in much grief. Harriet Adams testified to the events of the Saturday. When asked by the coroner, Baker was given the opportunity to question the witnesses. "I have no question to ask at present, thank you," he said. The last witness that day was Joseph Waters. When all testimony was heard, the deputy coroner asked Baker if he wished to say anything.
If you are watching this, you already know how a true crime story ends. So here is something almost no one knows. How 10 of these cases changed the law itself, the real reason the rules you trust today exist. This is only for the brave souls and the true crime seekers, the ones who do not just want the verdict, but what the ground kept after the courtroom buried it. We built something for you. 10 true cases, 40 archival engravings, 200 pages, told in the plain voice of a 19th century crime journal. No invention, no shock for its own sake. One question runs under every chapter, and once you read it, you will never look at a verdict the same way again. The door is here. Most will scroll past it. You will not. Go grab it before the launch price ends. Thank me later.
No, sir, only that I am innocent, Baker replied. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against Frederick Baker for killing and slaying Fanny Adams. Her death certificate, issued before the trial, states the cause of death as injuries inflicted by Frederick Baker, murder. The committal hearing was held at Alton Town Hall on Thursday, the 29th of August. A large mob had gathered outside, the Hampshire Telegraph reported. The removal of the prisoner from the town hall to the police station was not effected without some considerable difficulty. The moment the crowd outside caught sight of the prisoner, they uttered frightful yells and execrations, and an attempt was made to upset the cab in which he was taken away, which, in all probability, would have proved successful had it not been for the very vigorous manner in which the driver of the vehicle plied his whip. Baker's father, George Baker, was the principal defense witness at the committal hearing. He described his son as a weakly, nervous child. The senior Baker himself had, by his own admission, shown an inclination to assault and even to kill his own children. A cousin of Frederick Baker had been committed to an asylum 4 times. A sister had died of what was then called brain fever. Baker himself had attempted suicide after an unsuccessful love affair. The picture the defense was building was one of hereditary insanity. The magistrate was unmoved. Baker was committed for trial at the Winter, Assizes in Winchester. The trial of Frederick Baker opened in the Great Hall of Winchester Castle before Mr. Justice Mellor on Thursday, the 5th of December, 1867. Montague Bear conducted the prosecution. Samuel Carter defended. The prosecution case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. Bear told the jury that no single piece of evidence was conclusive on its own, but taken together, they formed a chain linked so firm as to render it impossible for the person around whom it was formed to escape. The defense offered what the legal press described as a confusing and contradictory double plea. Not guilty, but also guilty and insane. The argument was that Baker's family history of mental illness rendered him incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. His father's violence, his cousin's institutionalizations, his sister's death from brain fever, his own suicide attempt. The defense called Baker's father to the stand. George Baker described his son as a weakly, nervous child. The elder Baker's own violence toward his children was not lost on the courtroom. Here was a father testifying that his son was too mentally fragile to be held responsible for murder, while simultaneously revealing the household of terror in which that son had been raised. Let me pause on this, because it reveals something important about the Victorian legal system and its understanding of criminal responsibility. In 1867, the concept of insanity as a legal defense was still governed by the Manhattan Rules established in 1843. These rules held that a defendant could be found not guilty by reason of insanity only if, at the time of the act, he was laboring under such a defect of reason as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or, if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. The problem for Baker's defense was the diary. A man who did not understand the nature of what he had done would not have recorded it. A man who did not know that killing was wrong would not have attempted to conceal his involvement. Baker's diary entry was, paradoxically, both the prosecution's strongest evidence and the defense's greatest obstacle. It proved he did it. And it proved he knew he did it. 7 words, written in the calm hand of a man who understood exactly what he had done. Mr. Justice Mellor, presiding, delivered a careful charge to the jury. He advised them that they might consider the possibility that Baker was irresponsible for his actions through insanity. This was, by the legal standards of the day, an extraordinarily generous invitation. Most judges would have dismissed the insanity plea outright, given the evidence of premeditation and concealment. The jury was not impressed. They retired. Some accounts say 15 minutes, some say 5. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty. The foreman delivered the word, and the great hall of Winchester Castle, a space that had witnessed trials since the medieval period, heard the sentence that followed. Baker was to be taken to the place from whence he came, and from thence to a place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until he was dead. The judge placed the black cap upon his head. Baker stood in the dock and did not flinch. Baker was sentenced to death. In the weeks between sentencing and execution, Baker wrote a letter to George Adams. He asked for forgiveness. George, according to newspaper reports, returned a consolatory message. Whether George Adams truly forgave the man who had dismembered his daughter, or whether he simply lacked the words to refuse a condemned man's last request, no record tells us. At 8 o'clock on the morning of Christmas Eve, 1867, Frederick Baker was hanged outside Winchester's county prison. 5,000 people gathered to watch. A large proportion of the crowd, the newspapers noted, consisted of women. It was the last public hanging to take place at Winchester, and one of the final public executions in English history. The Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, which ended public hangings, would take effect the following year. Consider the timing. Christmas Eve. The day before the celebration of a child's birth was chosen as the day to execute a man for a child's murder. Whether this was coincidence or calculated moral theatre, the symbolism was not lost on the crowd. 5,000 people stood in the cold December morning and watched a man die for what he had done to an 8-year-old girl in a hop garden 4 months earlier. And then they went home to prepare for Christmas. Baker went to the gallows maintaining his innocence. He had written a contrite letter to George Adams, asking for forgiveness. He had also reportedly confessed to the prison chaplain in his final hours, though the details of that confession were never made public. The contradiction between his maintained innocence and his private admissions followed him to the scaffold. The speed of justice in this case was remarkable by any standard. Fanny Adams was murdered on the 24th of August. Baker was arrested the same evening. He was committed for trial on the 29th of August. His trial began on the 5th of December. He was executed on the 24th of December, exactly 4 months from crime to gallows. In 1867, the machinery of justice did not wait. But the question that this speed raises is worth asking. Was the trial fair? The defense had argued insanity, and the jury had rejected it in minutes. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. No witness saw Baker commit the murder. No murder weapon was definitively identified. The blood-stained stone was the probable instrument, but the defense had argued that the 2 small knives could not have accomplished the dismemberment, and no larger blade was ever found. The diary entry was damning. But Baker maintained at trial that it simply meant he was aware that a girl had been killed, not that he had killed her. He claimed he had written it while drunk. No one believed him. But the question of whether his mental state, his family's documented history of violence and institutionalization, should have been given greater weight is one that legal historians have debated for more than a century. In 1867, the jury decided in minutes. In 2026, the same evidence might sustain a very different argument about diminished responsibility. Now I want to talk about what happened to Fanny Adams after she was dead. Not to her body, which was buried in Alton Cemetery on the 28th of August, 1867, in a funeral attended by hundreds. Not to her grave, which still stands, marked by a headstone paid for by public subscription and made by her father's employers, J.H. and E. Dyer. The inscription reads, "Sacred to the memory of Fanny Adams, aged 8 years and 4 months, who was cruelly murdered on Saturday, August 24th, 1867. I want to talk about what happened to her name, and I want you to understand that what I am about to describe is not a footnote. It is the central moral failure at the heart of this story. In 1869, 2 years after the murder, the Royal Navy began issuing tinned mutton to sailors aboard its ships. The Admiralty had started manufacturing its own canned beef, and the contents of the tins were, by universal agreement, revolting. The meat was unrecognizable, grey and glutinous. It bore no resemblance to any animal a sailor could name. British sailors, with the particular black humour that has characterized the Royal Navy since the age of sail, began to suggest that the tins contained the remains of Fanny Adams. The connection was made because the timing of the tinned meat's introduction coincided with the national press coverage of Fanny's dismemberment. The sailors were making a joke about mutilated flesh. The mutilated flesh belonged to an 8-year-old girl. The empty tins were repurposed as mess tins. They became known as Fannies. During the First World War, soldiers in the trenches, possibly having heard the expression from sailors on the transport ships, began using Sweet Fanny Adams as a substitute for a far cruder phrase with the same initials. By the mid-20th century, the expression had passed into common English usage, meaning nothing at all. Sweet F.A., the phrase appears in novels, films, comedies, casual conversation. Most people who use it have no idea where it came from. They do not know that it originated in the dismemberment of a child. She is 60 years old. They do not know that the Fanny Adams they are invoking was a real person with a real name, and a mother who collapsed on the road trying to reach her husband with the news. The English language took a child's name and turned it into a synonym for emptiness, for worthlessness, for the total absence of anything that matters. There is no clearer example in the history of crime of how a victim's identity can be consumed by the very culture that should have protected her. And here is the irony that the entire story turns on. The one I want you to carry with you after this video ends. A real child who had a real name, who lived a real life, who was lively and cheerful and tall for her age, and loved by her parents, was murdered in the most horrifying manner imaginable, and the way the English language chose to remember her was by turning her name into slang for nothing, for emptiness, for the absence of anything at all. Fanny Adams was not nothing. She was born on the 30th of April, 1859. She had a best friend who lived 2 doors down. She wore a brown velvet hat. She played in the meadows of a town that had never known violence. She had an older sister named Ellen and younger sisters named Lizzie and Lily. She had a father who played cricket on Saturday afternoons, and a mother who took in washing to help make ends meet. She had grandparents who lived next door. She was described by a newspaper reporter who never met her alive as tall, comely, and intelligent. And if that sounds like a journalist reaching for kindness, it was also the truth. She was a child. She was happy. And the language that claimed her name owes her more than a punchline. The aftermath fell hardest on the people who loved her. And the weight of it did not diminish with time. It grew. Fanny's funeral was held on Wednesday, the 28th of August, 4 days after her murder. A large number of people assembled at Alton Cemetery. Wreaths of flowers were placed upon the coffin and upon the grave. The service was read by the Reverend W. Wilkins, curate of Thedon. A collection was taken to pay for a memorial stone. It was made by J.H. and E. Dyer, the building firm that employed Fanny's father. The headstone that George Adams helped to build during his working hours for other families was now the headstone his employers built for his daughter. The inscription reads, "Sacred to the memory of Fanny Adams, aged 8 years and 4 months, who was cruelly murdered on Saturday, August 24, 1867. Beneath it, a verse from the Gospel of Matthew, "Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul in hell." The stone was erected by voluntary subscription. The people of Alton, who had never known violence within living memory, reached into their pockets and paid for a monument to a child whose murder had shattered their belief in their own safety. Harriet Adams, Fanny's mother, never returned to Alton. The grief broke something in her that could not be repaired. She refused for the rest of her life to set foot in the town where her daughter had been taken. George Adams moved the family to London, where he found work with a builder and spent the next 26 years trying to raise his surviving children in a city that was not the place where Fanny had died. He told a reporter from Lloyd's weekly newspaper many years later in an interview that is painful to read even now, "The murder was such a terrible blow to my poor wife that I had to move from Alton so that she might be reminded of it as little as possible. We went to London, where I worked for a builder for 26 years. Now she is dead, and I am forced to come here." The "here" George was referring to was Farnham Workhouse. After Harriet's death, the man who had spent 3 decades trying to outrun the memory of what had happened to his daughter was reduced to parish charity. The bricklayer who had built walls and laid foundations for other families could not build a foundation solid enough to survive the destruction of his own. In a newspaper interview given near the end of his life, George sat with a reporter. His eyes filled with tears. His voice faltered as he spoke. He was an old man in a workhouse, and the girl in the meadow had been dead for 4 decades, and the tears were still fresh. He spent some time with his married daughter, Elizabeth, the Lizzie, who had been playing with Fanny on the day she was taken. He returned to Farnham Workhouse, where he died on the 17th of February, 1908. He was in his 70s. He had outlived his murdered daughter by 41 years. Lizzie, the 7-year-old who had been in the hollow with Fanny that afternoon, who had watched a man carry her sister into the hop garden and had run to Martha Warner's house to report what she saw. Grew up, she married, she had children, she became Elizabeth. She lived the rest of her life, knowing that she had been standing 10 feet from her sister when a stranger took her, and that the nearest adult had dismissed what she said. Whether Lizzie heard strangers use the phrase "sweetmate Adams" in her later years, and what she felt when they did, no record preserves. Minnie Warner, Fanny's best friend, lived out her life in Alton. Her gravestone still stands in the town cemetery, not far from Fanny's. 2 friends, reunited in the earth of the same town where one of them was taken. The hop garden where Fanny was murdered is gone. The lane is built upon. The flood meadow is still there, a patch of green on the northern edge of a town that has grown around it. The Curtis Museum in Alton holds a leaflet about the case. The Duke's Head Inn, where the inquest was held, was renamed the George, and still stands on Butts Road. The police station where Baker was held is now the site of a fire station. Alton remembers. The town did not choose to be the place where this happened, but it has not looked away from it either. The diary is still in the archive. That single entry, in Baker's own hand, in the same ink he used to record the weather and the price of a drink, killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. 7 words, an 8-year-old child, a town that had never known crime. And a Saturday afternoon in August that ended the way no Saturday afternoon should end, anywhere, ever. Fanny Adams was 8 years old. She was lively, she was cheerful. She had a best friend who lived 2 doors down. She wore a brown velvet hat and a white pinafore and red wool underskirts, and she walked up Tanhouse Lane on a hot afternoon in 1867, and she did not come back. The question this story refuses to answer is whether Frederick Baker knew when he wrote that sentence in his diary that it would outlive him by more than a century. Whether the man who recorded a child's murder in the same breath as the weather understood what he was confessing. Or whether, for him, it really was just another Saturday. The ground in Alton kept what the courtroom could not, and the diary, in its leather case in its archive, keeps the rest. What remains of Fanny Adams is not slang. It is not a joke. It is a headstone in a Hampshire cemetery, a gravestone paid for by strangers who never knew her but understood that she mattered. It is the last thing Frederick Baker wrote before the world found out what he had done. And it is fine. And it is hot. And the girl in the meadow is gone. If this story has stayed with you, there is one unanswered question I want to leave in the comments. What does it say about a culture that turns a murdered child's name into a phrase meaning nothing? And what do we owe the real Fanny Adams now, more than a century and a half later? Tell me what you think. Tell me where you are listening from. And if this channel has earned your trust, I will see you in the next one.